Ronnie Kasrils was born in the late 1930s to working-class parents in Yeoville, Johannesburg. A star athlete, Kasrils would go on to matriculate from the King Edward High School close to his childhood home. What started off as a fairly standard middle-class suburban life took a turn on the 21st of March 1960. A demonstration against draconian apartheid pass laws would culminate in the Sharpeville massacre, wherein 69 people were killed. This marked a political turning point for Kasrils, prompting him to join the then banned African National Congress, a radical move for a young white South African at the time. And the rest, as they say, is history. Kasrils would become a founding member of the ANC's military wing, Umkhonto weSizwe, and later served in Thabo Mbeki's cabinet as the Minister of Intelligence Services. Tim Modise sits down with the 81-year-old Kasrils upon the release of his latest memoir titled Catching Tadpoles, a coming-of-age tale about how a young Jewish boy gave up a life of privilege to join the liberation struggle.
Well, once again, it's an honor and pleasure for me to talk to one of the eminent struggle heroes of our time, Mr. Ronnie Kasrils, who's just published a new book. It's called Catching Tadpoles, The Shaping of a Young Rebel. He's earned his stripes, he's been around a long time, has served in government, went into exile, has got a massive story to tell. And he's with me here. So I'll be talking to him about the book, I'll be talking to him about his life and times and his views on the developments in the country. Mr. Kasrils.
Mr. Modise.
Pleasure once again to talk to you. Let me start first with one of the stalwarts of the struggle, Professor Ben Turok, who passed on recently. I just want you to pay tribute to him and briefly remember him, what he meant to you. I interacted with him, and I did say on social media that one of the most informed, engaging, critical thinkers of our time, and you always left a conversation with him having learned something, notwithstanding that it would be an interview on the topic of the day.
A very, very profound thinker, extremely dedicated to the liberation of our country and our people. When I then met him, was the secretary of the Congress of Democrats. Very exciting, dangerous, on the run. I was asked to slip illegal leaflets under the doors in Hillbrow, which was a solely white suburb at the time, and places like Yeoville and elsewhere, put up stickers, lift the state of emergency, release the detainees, forward to freedom, etc. He was a young guy at the time, but incredibly profound, and I could see in him a person who was an activist, but also almost professorial. His academic life, political, economic life came later. We both, without knowing it, because it was neat to know, were in Umkhonto weSizwe at the same time, at its inception. Yeah. And he was the counterpart of Oliver Tambo and Mandela, of all the greats of the struggle. He was adored by younger people because he had a lot of time for younger people.
Well, I suppose that's why I said what I said, that, yeah, you know, in the interactions with him, one was left feeling that way. And of course, he'll be remembered for his contributions in our nation. Now, your new book, Catching the Tadpoles, right? You, in recent times, you've written books more about contemporary affairs, or at least a couple of decades back. But here you're going back
to the beginning,
to the beginning of the story.
Infancy.
Yeah, and coming from a very colorful family, from one, I mean it in the sense of the spirit of adventure. Sure. within your family. True. Can you just give me a sense of your teenage years, your youthful years, in the Joburg of the time?
I'm born in 1938.
Yes.
That's quite significant era because it's the eve of the Second World War. The Nazis are already in power in Germany. The Holocaust, the persecution of Jews, and that's my tribe, if I can use the term.
Yes.
The oppression's already underway, but it's the point where they're attacked.
Yes.
In the streets, their shops, their houses, people are killed, and then they ending up in what became the death camps and the gas ovens. My grandparents on both sides, maternal and paternal, came from the Russian Empire and came out to South Africa. The paternal grandfather, Nathan Kasrils, actually came out as a 20-year-old in 1880 to look for diamonds. His wife and my father, born in Lithuania as well, which is where he came from, come out in 1900, my father aged 1. My mother's side of the family also come from that part of Russia, and they come out in about 1900. My mother's born here 1908. They flee from the Tsarist pogroms. These are xenophobic attacks on Jewish settlements in the Russian Empire.
Yes.
And my grandfather, Nathan Kasrils, in 1880, he's almost a pioneer of the Kimberley diamond diggings, where he encounters Cecil John Rhodes and these other sort of top mining magnates who begin to consume and own everything and push out the small diggers. So he develops an abiding hatred of high capital and of British imperialism. He sides with the Boers during the Boer War.
I find the story of, was it Quos de la Rey, that there was some connection there. I mean, I don't know if...
With Quos de la Rey of all people.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. I mean, what did this mean to you when you had this story?
I was absolutely surprised. In a sense, proud. Now, you know, given that the Boers were regarded as obviously standing against the African people,
yes,
and severe racists, to be sure. But the main racists and colonizers were the British. So just to put in a word for my grandfather, Nathan,
yes, coming
out of Russia, and the Jews there had developed quite a strong socialist and Marxist approach. And Lenin, apart from others, was sympathetic to the Boers because they were fighting the main imperialist power of the world of the time,
yes,
British imperialism. And they saw in the Boers fighters against imperialism.
The resistance movement of sorts.
If the Boers had freed the blacks, we know they couldn't because they'd been slave owners, but something similar was done in Cuba, you know, where the ancestors of the Castros, who were Spanish migrants, had freed their slaves to fight against Spanish rule.
Yes.
If that had happened, South Africa would have been a different place. If the Boers had realized that to beat the British, they had to free the blacks.
Tell me, in your community at the time, given, you know, the outline that you've given, I can imagine how the Jewish community was coping with all of that, the kinds of teachings that were going on in the households. Probably not all of them, but at least in yours.
Mine were particularly progressive, basically because my parents, they weren't very political. But they were very, very kind-hearted people. My mother especially. My father was a bit more remote to me, but he was a working man, and his view was that anyone who worked needed to get paid a decent wage, irrespective of race. This was very progressive for the time. My mother was incredibly kind-hearted person, and from her knees, from her lap, I learnt to respect everybody. And she would use the Judaic religion. She wasn't too religious either, but she was Jewish. She had imbibed the morality, do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. So, young Ronald, you mustn't behave like these neighbors, or even some of our relatives. You know, we don't like to speak to African people the way they do. she couldn't abide the rough language, the rough ways of the white people, even family members, to African people or to other so-called non-whites, Indian, coloured people. Very kind in that sense. And one of the most dramatic things that happened in my mother's presence was, as a 7-year-old, being taken for a treat to the then Bioscope, which is what we call the cinemas. And these were gorgeous cinemas, Metro Goldwyn Mayer, 20th Century Fox, the Plaza, Coliseum, all downtown Joburg. And suddenly she's yanking me away from where we were walking, and there's bedlam and there's screaming and shouting, and she rushes me onto the other side of the road with a lot of other white people, and I see 4 thugs, youngish white thugs, with knuckle dusters on their fists, beating an African man into the gutter, the blood pouring from his head. He had been wearing and was wearing a beautiful sports jacket. He was nicely dressed. I remembered seeing his black and white brogues, his two-toed shoes. So he was one of these guys who obviously had a job, had a little bit of money, and took pride in his dress. A white guy on our side of the road who's also run away, but a racist for sure, because we hear him explaining, oh, that native, except it was a much cruder word, he deserves it. This is a white man's town. He refused to get out of the way of those guys. They're teaching him a lesson. We had heard a white woman shout and scream, stop, stop, you're murdering him, you're killing him. And they swore back at her, shut up, you white, this and that. I couldn't sleep that week. And my mother, this is the lesson of my life at the age of 7, going 8. I said to my mother, the way black people are being treated in South Africa, is this what was happening to our people, the Jews, in Germany? And I can see her face still, thoughtfully choosing her words. And she says, well, Ronald, it's not like that here yet. But it starts with the kind of cruelty we see, even in terms of language, the way people are spoken to, as you can see in our neighborhood, which is why your father and I are always saying to you, don't follow what you hear the neighbors say. Be kind and respectful.
Dr. Kasrils,
yes.
I will be looking at your formative years as a teenager in a short while. And for now, we pause right there. First impression that made such a lasting impression on the young Ronnie Kasrils way back then, and we'll be exploring what happens in his earlier formative years, teenagehood years, and also coming back to the present, his views on the current state of our nation.